Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this special public discussion. It's wonderful to see you all here. My name is Josh Horden, and I'll be chairing the event this evening. It's a joint event between the Philosophy Society and the Christian Union. I'm a member of the Philosophy Society and of the Christian Union, so it's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. The title for this evening is The Resurrection of Jesus, Religious Invention or Historical Fact. And we're delighted to welcome our speakers, Gary Habermas and Ken Humphreys. And I'll hand over now to Georgie Gardner, who is the president of the Philosophy Society, who will be introducing Gary Habermas.
Thank you. Good evening. Professor Gary Habermas gained his PhD from Michigan State University. He's now a distinguished research professor at Liberty University and is a visiting professor at 15 different graduate schools and universities. He's published 32 books, half of which are on the resurrection. Gary Habermas. And now I'll pass you back to Josh to introduce Ken.
Kenneth Humphreys has taught both in the UK and abroad, including a senior lectureship in modern languages. Religion, and in particular the claims of Christianity, have been a real lifelong interest for Ken. He's now fully occupied as a writer, radio broadcaster and public speaker, and campaigns energetically against the tide of resurgent superstition and unreason. I'll give you Kenneth Humphreys. With those introductions over, I'll now explain the format for this evening. We'll start off with two statements, one from Ken initially, and then from Gary, of 15 minutes or 18 minutes of length, around about that sort of length. And then we'll have some responses from both sides of about 5 minutes or so. And then we'll have a time of open discussion between the two speakers. After that, there'll be a time of Q&A. And for that time, all you need to do is raise up your hand, and I'll point to you, and the roving mic will reach you. Then just say the question nice and clearly, and then they'll respond. After that, we'll have some closing comments from the speakers, and then we'll finish. So, to begin our public discussion this evening, we have Ken Humphreys.
Good evening. I'm not a great believer in conspiracy theories, but it did seem as if today somebody on high was making life difficult, because there was a 4-hour delay at Gatwick Airport thanks to an unusual storm. If it was an attempt to prevent my speaking here tonight, it did at least fail. Okay, let me thank both the Christian Union and the Philosophy Society of Edinburgh University for this opportunity to speak. Let me also thank Gary Habermas for this willingness to debate on a topic that I certainly find of consuming interest. So there's some joy in that, but I should also say there's some sadness in the fact that here we are in the early years of the 21st century, and yet we are discussing the reality or otherwise of the resurrection of a man from beyond the grave. It would perhaps in all places seem unfortunate here in the city of David Hume that we have to discuss this issue, because I think he himself, if we allow the possibility, would be turning in his grave that we still entertain such ideas. In view of the time span, I may have to speak fast, but we have a lot of ground to cover. The 19th century was notable for the progress of humanity in its understanding of the universe, and its successes, of course, led to the retreat of religion in many spheres, so that it was a reasonable expectation on the part of many thinkers in the early years of the 20th century that by now, religion would have retreated into the shadows. And it certainly seemed that way as the hammer blows of science and rationality forced religion to retreat. And it no longer, with any great commitment, maintained its old truths. Now, that prevailing optimism of a rational future without superstition prevailed through much of the 20th century, of course. And I can remember in my early childhood, the enthusiasm of projects like the putting of men on the moon, that the future seemed to be bright and the future seemed to be very rational. And what perhaps helped summarize and capture that optimism for a scientific future was a program like Star Trek, which gave us on a weekly basis a vision of what life might be like in the 23rd century. It would be a rational future where mankind would boldly go across the universe, and religion didn't figure in that really much at all. If you remember the early series of Star Trek, well, the only time religion intruded was when a primitive alien race was either deluded or some devious aliens were using technology to fool simple people. But humanity was guided by the logic of science. Now, that seemed to be sufficient for most of us back in the 60s and 70s. And it's rather surprising that now in the 21st century, some of the battles that had been fought in the 19th century need to be refought. Now, why is that? Well, I think partly the answer is the same wealth that brought us things like the Apollo mission and putting man on the moon also fed itself into colleges of biblical study throughout the USA, who had, since the famous monkey trial in Tennessee in the 1920s, been somewhat cowering in a corner, very uncertain about the future because rationality and science threatened the very existence of organized religion. Now, they may have become a footnote in history were it not for the fact that some of the delights of technology, such as television, made it possible for religion to move to the forum of mass communication, and we had the rise of TV evangelicals who were very adept at selling Christ and very adept at raising vast amounts of money. Now, from that time in the 1970s, these institutions have developed a response to the rational revolution. They've learnt certain tricks and certain ways to gain credibility, one of which is to use some of the language of science. So they talk about data, for example, in a very scientific term. The wealth provided a number of scholarships, provided the development of a number of biblical schools, even the emergence of some strange institutions called Christian universities. Certainly strange to any rationalist, that is. Okay, they have come forward now with a number of explanations, if we put it that way, which challenge science across a broad front. We're all familiar with the notion of now called intelligent design or creation science, which is thrown down the gauntlet, of course, to evolutionary biology. We have the challenge of something called young Earth geology. And of course, we have a whole body of information relating to the central beliefs of Christianity, which are no longer perceived as simply matters of faith, but we are told they are matters of fact and history. And the resurrection of Jesus is described now as one of the best attested facts in history, which to anyone of a rational disposition seems an extraordinary claim, that we might be able to maintain the resurrection of a person from death 2,000 years ago is better attested than, say, the Battle of Actium or Julius Caesar. But these claims are regularly made. Now, let me familiarise you, those of you who have never entered the twilight zone of Christian apologetics, just how this methodology works. And I'll briefly give you an introduction. It won't take more than about 3 minutes, which I think we just about have time for, but as it relates to a different resurrection, that is, of someone other than Jesus. Now, the person I'm going to take for this example is actually known to you all, and you immediately recognise the example. If we take the story of Snow White, you will know that she returned from death through the kiss of a prince. Now, many of you might think that that is a fairy story, but actually it's one of the best attested events in history. Now, how can we prove that point? Well, we have a number of first-hand witnesses to that event. For example, we have the handsome prince himself. Now, his life was changed by that event. He got married. He lived happily ever after. So we have a witness there that we can rely upon. Who else do we have? We have the wicked queen. Now, that's a particularly good witness because she gives enemy attestation of the event. She wanted Snow White dead, but no. So we have a second really good witness. We had the witness of the servant who was sent to kill Snow White. Now, he changed his mind, of course. He didn't kill Snow White in the forest, he let her live. So here we have a very good witness from a cynic, a skeptic. We could say that he changed his mind. He's a third good witness. Now, we have something which we might also describe as an embarrassing witness. For example, we had the witness of the magic mirror. The magic mirror is such an obvious silliness that the fact that it's in the story proves that it must be true. Okay, and giving some support to that idea is an early creed. That creed, as we all know, is mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of us all. Now that shows that that story is actually can be traced back to prior evidence. The creed obviously preceded the story. So we have the evidence there of a creed. Who else do we have to bear out this story as history? Well, of course, we had the statements made by Happy, Grumpy, Sleepy, Sneezy, Dopey, Bashful, and Doc. We have 7 first-hand witnesses to the resurrection. In total, then, we have 11 witnesses, first-hand statements that this is actually history. Do we believe it? Of course we don't. It's a fairy story. I'm just playing with words. And Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs is a fairy story. And I'm sorry to tell some of you that Jesus Christ and the 12 disciples is a fairy story. And evidence for the resurrection is constructed in precisely the way I've outlined. Now, we might maintain, of course, it could all be true anyway, in which case it requires a miracle. Now, I'm not going to rule out a miracle a priori. After all, by its very definition, it's something so unusual we wouldn't know it, we wouldn't have evidence for it. At least, how would we prove that it had ever occurred? Okay, so my point would be that we have no evidence for the resurrection other than that which has been carefully constructed by people so motivated to maintain the truths of a religion which had been weakened to the point of almost self-destruction by the proofs of science. But nonetheless, you know, the industry which can present this story as fact has vast strength, vast resources, transmits its message across the world, holds forums explaining how it is all true, and I have to say, it is all bogus. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I too had problems getting here, so I think we're even. We left, well, I won't go into detail, but we were in the storm. And then I get up here and I try to take some notes, and my pen quit writing. That's a serious matter. So, you know, whose side are the forces of nature on? I don't know. I would like to also begin by thanking the Christian Union and the Philosophical Society of Edinburgh University, and both Josh and Georgie. I appreciate this opportunity. Beautiful venue. Nice to be with you. Flew into town today. Have to leave tomorrow, but I'm very happy to be with you this evening. I'm defending the view that you just heard was a fairy tale, but that's okay. Ken's a good guy. We've talked on the phone. We had a little time before. I told him, I said, if we were neighbors, we would probably get together during a football game and we'd have a lot of chats. I think we should. I think this thing is wonderful, a discussion like this. Let me first begin by telling you some things I am not going to try to do. Or, so you're clear about my position, things I am not defending. Okay? First of all, I do not argue that Christianity is vindicated by faith and we should all believe. I am interested in data, historical data, to be exact, other kinds. Secondly, I will not argue tonight the Bible tells me so. My beliefs about the Bible aside, I will not assume inspiration of the Bible, biblical reliability, or anything of the sort. I'm going to make an argument for the resurrection that borrows sources and data from critics, agnostics, atheists who are writing today. The biggest name scholars writing today of those mindsets, I'm going to use their data. At no point will I assume, I mean, of course I'm willing to talk about the Bible, and I assume Ken will too. But I think what I'm saying is, I'm referring to the Bible as an ancient document. The way you might ask a question about Shakespeare or Homer or somebody else, Suetonius, Tacitus, what do we know about data? Thirdly, I do not believe that things are true because scholars say so. I should say it this way. I don't think things are true just because scholars say so. But I think it's very, very important that we understand the scholarly lay of the land for this reason. Not because scholarship proves anything, but because if scholars from the left, right, and center agree on something, they probably agree for good reasons. There are probably reasons behind their agreement. But I don't think citing scholars solves the issue. I'm not going to argue tonight, it might surprise some of you, I'm not going to argue tonight that the resurrection is a miracle. I'm going to argue that the resurrection is an event that occurred in history. A man named Jesus of Nazareth died, and a man named Jesus of Nazareth was later seen. And that would constitute resurrection, to appear after a real death. So that's my argument. Because I'm giving deference to David Hume here, we're in his city, and he says a miracle is an act of God that breaks the laws of nature, and that's just part of a discussion I'm not going to be able to get into. Those are some thoughts up front. What I do want to say is, let me go back to this earlier topic. I want to argue that we have data for the resurrection, and I'm going to give an argument here in just a moment for the resurrection, and I'm going to limit my facts almost totally to folks with whom I have huge disagreements. I'm going to limit my survey to, as I said, atheist, agnostic, and skeptical New Testament scholars or theologians. Because once again, I'll repeat the principle. I'll go in reverse order. There's two principles here. The second one is, I build a lot on where scholarship is. Not because that in itself proves anything, but because I think scholarship is there for a reason. And when believers and unbelievers agree about something, it's usually because there are reasons. It's usually because there are data. Okay, so if you ask a Christian, if you said, here's the New Testament, and you want to talk about this man Jesus? And the Christian says, yes. And he said, but the man's in the book. Yep. I don't believe the book, so I don't believe the man. That's a thoughtful objection. And I'm going to take about that same approach tonight because, as I said, I'm not going to assume either inspiration or reliability. But if you ask the average Christian that question, they're going to say something like this. Well, if we want to talk about the resurrection of Jesus, we need to take a look at the Gospels of Mark in normal order. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And these Gospels are usually strewn along a timeline from about 65 to 95 AD. For example, the well-known skeptical scholar G.A. Wells, who from London area, argues that all of these Gospels are written before 120 AD. Okay, that's a typical approach, but I think the best approach to argue for the resurrection is to use the writings of the Apostle Paul, for this reason. Today, Paul is the critic's darling, you might say. Critics from the opposite side of the spectrum that I'm on will say Paul is the critic's darling. Why? Well, Michael Martin, atheistic professor of philosophy in the U.S., wrote a book called The Case Against Christianity. He says this: Paul's testimony is the only eyewitness testimony we have for a resurrection appearance of Jesus. Okay, so I can either say, well, wait a minute, how about the Gospels? Or I can say, I'll take Paul and move with him. And just to start, I'm going to take Paul. Now, probably the best-known critic in our country, the best-known skeptic in our country is an agnostic scholar, and his name is Bart Ehrman. He's written a number of books. Generally, he's published by Oxford University Press, so there's a little tie across the ocean. And Bart talks about the undisputed epistles of Paul, as almost every New Testament scholar does. And they will generally label 7 books with that title. Bart would say Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon. And I'll just note in passing, G.A. Wells gives the exact same list with Colossians added. So G.A. Wells has 8 epistles. These are dated between 50, sometimes scholars go back as early as 48, but these are dated from 50 to 60 A.D. G.A. Wells dates them from 50 to 60 A.D. So I'm using G.A. Wells, and I'm using Bart Ehrman, an agnostic. So I'll say, okay, well, let's take a look at Paul's epistles. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, beginning with verse 3, Paul says this. He says in verse 3, I gave you what I was given. And he's using technical words for passing on tradition. Now, if we believe Paul's own testimony that he was a Pharisee, we know from Josephus and others that these same terms are used by Pharisees for the passing on of tradition. This is a society where it's very possible that 90% of Jesus' audience was illiterate. And for that kind of an audience, you have to tell stories, perhaps. We call those parables. Or you have to make statements, shorter, pithier statements. And I think that was the creedal portion of the Snow White story, because critics make a big deal of short passages in the New Testament that basically answer the question of what did earliest Christian preaching consist before the very first New Testament book was written. And creeds are the answer to that question. They fill in the gap between 30-ish, the approximate death of Jesus, 30-ish and 50-ish AD. And Paul's reporting one of these. If contemporary critical theology agrees on one thing today, it's that 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in that text, beginning with verse 3, Paul is reporting material. Let me step out here and do it this way. If this is 55 AD, the writing of his book, and back to that table is the death of Jesus. Let's just say it that way. Paul says 55 AD, the dates are the same, whether you're looking at critics or believers or whatever. And Paul says, verse 3, I gave you what I was given. Now let me first give you a critic's conclusion. This was not developed by believers or conservatives. It came from the critical side of town. I'm not pointing at Ken, by the way. I'm talking about my timeline here. And here's the conclusion. that they come up with. I'll be glad during the Q&A or any other time to give you bibliography, names, dates, doctoral theses, whatever you want. But the leading conclusion is that Paul received this material in 35 AD. And here's how they get this. The cross, about 30. Paul's conversion is placed at about +2. Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, an undoubted Pauline epistle. In fact, Bart Ehrman calls these 6 epistles that I've already outlined for you, he calls them undisputed Pauline epistles. There may be a person here, and there are a few people, but for the most part, for an agnostic New Testament specialist like Bart Ehrman to refer to the undisputed Pauline epistles, he must not see too many people on the horizon who are going to disagree with this picture. And the idea is, here's about 30 AD. Paul meets the risen Jesus, he claims, about +2 after this event. He says 3 years later, Galatians chapter 1, 3 years later I went up to Jerusalem, 2 + 3, 5. So we're at about 35 AD. And Paul said, when I went to Jerusalem, he said, I didn't just go up there. Well, C.H. Dodd of Cambridge makes a famous statement. He said, Paul didn't go to Cambridge. Paul didn't go to Cambridge at all. He said, Paul didn't go to Jerusalem to talk about the weather. What did he do? He said, I interviewed Peter, the apostle of Jesus, and James, the brother of the Lord. And he said, they're the only 2 apostles I saw, and I talked to them for 15 days. In context, Paul is witnessing regarding, in the context, they're talking about the nature of the gospel. And then right afterwards, Paul says, I assure you I didn't lie about this. I talked to these fellows, and we confirmed the gospel. This is just +5. Now, critics argue that Paul received this creedal passage. Recently, Richard Bauckham, just recently retired from St. Andrews. He's living in Cambridge today. And Richard Bauckham has just argued that what I'm giving to you is not some conservative, if you believe, inspiration kind of. He argues this is the consensus of modern scholarship. The consensus puts Paul's receiving this material in 35 AD. But the 2 men from whom Paul probably believed this material and received this material, Peter and James. Now, let me just stop there for a second. I'm not talking about Paul's own appearance. I'm talking about the 2 disciples talking about their appearances. Peter, James, the brother of the Lord. And he hears this here at about +5. But these 2 men had the material, obviously. They had it before Paul had it. So we have to be earlier than 35. Now, creedal material is formulated. It reads in the Greek, it reads a da-da-da-da-da-da-da, style. Now, it doesn't rhyme like English poetry, but there's a staccato sense to it. It breaks the syntax of the sentence. Anyway, scholars have pretty well agreed where these things are. And again, there's scholars over on the other side of the equation. So, now let me stretch out this 5 years. This is 35, that's 30. Paul receives this material. It's a consensus of scholarship, according to St. Andrews, Richard Bauckham. Paul receives this material +35. The 2 men from whom he received it, Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, had to have it before him. If you're going to give it to somebody, you have it first. Now, this is the date of the formulation of the creed. The events on which the creed are based has to be earlier still. And if you have 2 steps in between 30 AD and 35 AD, we're getting back very, very close to the events in question. How close? Am I just talking about conservative Christians? I am not. For example, let me cite one of the men on Ken's website, Gerrit Ludemann, atheist New Testament scholar in Germany. Gerrit Ludemann says, he admits this whole timeline, and he says, as well as the general dates for the epistles of Paul, what's called the authentic, the undisputed epistles, and Ludemann says, the latest that this material became a creed, the latest is 33 AD, or +3. He said that's the latest. In our country, we have a group of folks called the Jesus Seminar. They're extremely skeptical. In the press, they're almost synonymous with skepticism. They're the ones who throw beads in the hat, and they've rejected 80 to 90%, depending on how you count, they reject 80 to 90% of the so-called red letter sayings of Jesus. The Jesus Seminar, not conservative, founded by Irish scholar John Dominic Cross and American scholar Marcus Borg, who's an Oxford grad, by the way, But they founded the Jesus Seminar, and they say the latest this material could be is plus 2 years after the death of Jesus. Plus 2 years. The latest contributors to this discussion are 3 British scholars. One right here in this city. Well, he's an American, but he's the head of a British department here, Larry Hurtado. And he said recently he has studied the subject of the deity of Christ. It's been his specialty for 35 years. And he said there's never a time when the earliest Christian preaching, there was never a time when Jesus was not preached as A, divine, and B, raised from the dead. In other words, Hurtado says the message goes back to 30 AD. Second case, the one I mentioned, Richard Bauckham, St. Andrews. He says exactly the same. Never was a time when Jesus was preached as anything other than deity or raised. Now I'm going to tell you why this is important in a moment. Third voice is as influential a scholar as there is today in historical Jesus studies, James or Jimmy D.G. Dunn, University of Durham. And Dunn, in a recent book on Jesus Remembered, Dunn says this material becomes formally creedalized material no later than 30 AD. Now, folks, these are scholars from some of your own universities here. In fact, I could mention Tom Wright in here, too, professor both Oxford and Cambridge. Folks, this is not an example of what kind of silly Christians are still believing this since David Hume. This is not an example of, I think it's kind of a red herring to say, what about TV preachers and Snow White? How do these people get away with teaching this kind of poppycock at Edinburgh, Durham, Oxford, Cambridge? Wouldn't they be drummed out of court if this was on the level of Snow White? You'd think so. But these fellows have written extremely influential books. Now I'm going to have to stop in a moment, but here's where I'm going. If Jesus dies here, and there never was a time when he was preached as anything other than deity, dead, and buried, what Christianity calls the gospel. If there never was a time, what that means is we don't wait decades and have somebody say, oh, look, Virgo, that must be the virgin birth, which was recently proclaimed. Or go a few more decades and say, hey, I think this guy must be God. I don't want to be second best to the other religions around here, Isis and Osiris and others. Let's say he's God. Yeah, I'll say he's God. If you say he's God, yeah, from now on he's God. Oh, hey, what happens to gods? They're raised from the dead. So another 100 years later, we say he's raised from the dead. That's not the way it went. When you're doing historiography, the key to historiography, there's a bunch of rules. And actually, Ken did a good job mentioning some of the rules. Embarrassing testimony. This is just the way the New Testament scholars do it. It's the way historians write the past. And give you examples if you want. But the two most important things in historiography are the two E's, early and eyewitness. Early and eyewitness data. And what you have if the story goes back here and you have 3 folks talking just 5 years later. By the way, just a few years after that, Galatians 2, Paul goes back to Jerusalem. He said, I laid before them the gospel I was preaching, of which he says the resurrection is an indispensable part. Peter's there, James, the brother of Jesus, is there, now John's there. This is the big 4. They're the most influential believers in the early church. Paul said, I set my gospel before them, and they added nothing to me. You know what that shows? It means Paul didn't make it up. It means it didn't come decades later because they're all agreeing. That's what that means. So on historical principles alone, that on the left wants to say, hey, these are the rules of engagement. They've set the rules on this because they came up with this. What we have is a report that is early. How in the ancient world, where the first biography of Alexander is plus 400 years after Alexander the Great, we have a report from 30 AD. And we have 4 major eyewitnesses. Folks, I'm just saying, this is only beginning tonight, but I think we're well on the basis of saying this is more than Snow White or Christian happenstance.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. Gary has tipped the bucket open now, and we can look at some substantial points here. I agree we should look at Paul. I mean, he's a main man here. In fact, we should look at both Pauls, because if you read the epistles, you'll actually identify a totally different man from the one you read in the book of Acts. Now, that should make you wonder for a start. Why is the man who writes these epistles, why is he this bombastic bully, whereas the man you find written up in the book of Acts is this team player who's on side with the other disciples? He's taken, he's delivered, he's brought here, he's brought there. That is not the Paul that lays down the law in his epistles. So that at least should make you wonder. Okay, he mentions this early creed, which I referred to in the Snow White story. Now, yeah, I agree, it's a creed. And the way you can identify it's a creed, if you take the verses before and after, you realise they run on to each other. The creed is there, and it wasn't part of the original. Now, let me give you an alternative to this idea, as Gary goes with his timeline back to the beginning. You know, there is an alternative, that creed was not there at the beginning, it was inserted afterwards. And he mentions Gert Ludemann as agreeing with it. Well, I'll give him a scholar. Robert Price does not. Okay, we can all quote scholars. Robert Price says that's an interpolation inserted in the 2nd century. And that's more likely, and I'll tell you why that's more likely. Compare the possibilities. Would people who witness an extraordinary event called the resurrection rush off and write down a creed? Would they really do that? First he was seen of Cephas, and then he was seen of the disciples, etc., etc. Would they really do that? Where do we get creeds from? You think of the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, various other creeds of the church. Where do they originate? Do they start with those? No, they are the resolution of church conflict. They come out of the struggle of different contended factions of Christianity to agree what they were going to believe. And after the fight, which was acrimonious, often violent, if you consider the origin of the Nicene Creed, it came after the battle with the Arians, and Arius was murdered. You know, and then you have the creed. You don't have it to begin with, so at least consider the alternative to this earliness of the creed. It's a later interpolation. Compare that creed to what is said in the actual Gospels. First he was seen of Cephas. What was he? What does the book of John say? I thought that was Mary Magdalene. You know, if you compare the creed to the Gospel story, it doesn't link at all. Let's take one other very crucial line that perhaps Gary can illuminate. Paul, in his creed, says Jesus was seen above 500 of the brethren. Where does it come from? Certainly not found in the Gospels. Isn't it curious that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John don't refer to 500 witnesses of the resurrection? I wonder if Gary can provide an explanation for that, because I can. It's found in the Buddhist texts. There's an explanation for you. Gary, I think, will be hard-pressed to find an explanation for it. Let's take another matter relating to Paul. Notice how it slipped into the dialogue, the authentic epistles of Paul. Now, I would suggest that if you actually start any study of the epistles, you will realise that from the word go, many of them are fake. The debate among scholars is just how many of them are fake. Everyone seems to agree that Hebrews was not really written by Paul, but were any of the others? Were the prison epistles? You know, were the pastoral epistles? Weren't they written by the church to try and establish the power of the bishops later in the 2nd century? The whole genre of Pauline literature was fabricated, and okay, it is more difficult with some core epistles to identify quite when they originated and quite by whom they were written, but clearly there are several writers involved in the so-called Pauline epistles. So there's many gaps in Gary's story there. He uses, as I've noticed, the word data, really, relating to supposed events. I would say if you try and build up a timeline, which part of the story do you begin with assuming is correct? Because you can build a timeline so long as you assume, for example, I'm sure Gary will assume, well, Jesus was crucified and there was an empty tomb. Let's assume that bit, then let's try and work out the rest. But why should we make that assumption? Should we not actually find evidence of everything? You know, if we are to believe that this is truth and not a fairy tale, should it not all be substantiated? So I put it to you, there are so many areas of concern and doubt in the story. This cleverly wrapping it up with so multiple witnesses is all a fraud. It's all a fraud. And we can go on to look at these many witnesses, which I'm sure Gary will want to cite, and actually look what they say. And when you look at what they say, it really doesn't substantiate the claims made for them. So I repeat, we are dealing with a fairy story.
I commend you on getting what I count 7 arguments in 5 minutes. That's brilliant, and I mean that. Let me try to respond to all 7. First question, which Paul do we believe? The Paul of the Acts or the Paul of the Epistles? It's very easy in terms of my debate tonight. I've already said I'll be glad to go back and talk about the Gospels, and I'll put Acts in that group. But I'm starting with Paul's authentic epistles tonight. More about that in a moment. So it's very easy. If somebody were to say to me, Acts contradicts Paul, I say, hey, I disagree. And I'll be glad to talk to you about that tonight. But that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm going to stay with Paul. So if you say you must choose, I'll take Paul. It's that easy. A later book can't militate against the early one. And by the way, who concludes that? John Dominic Crossan. He said, when Acts goes against Paul, I'll take Paul every time. I didn't think I agreed with Dom on too much, but I agree. The Creed. Bob Price is a very good friend of mine, and he and I have dialogued. You can find this on our website. Bob, okay, we're not going to settle with head count. Bob is about, there might be 3 other scholars in the world. My bibliography in the resurrection is over 3,000 sources. Bob is about the only person who believes this portion is interpolated. Richard Carrier, from the same Internet Infidels group in America, Richard thinks Bob is incorrect. Now, I mean, that can happen. But if we find a person and say, well, Bob disagrees with you, okay. Without exaggerating, in fact, I have a book right here where you can check the end note out. I have 30 scholars in here, all of them skeptics, all of them critics, all of them agnostics, and they agree with this timeline. Now, look, I'm not saying it's 30-1, therefore I'm right. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying if it's, remember my lead comment, if it's 30-1, it's probably because the reasons are better on that side. Okay? Thirdly, and he also made the comment about Arians, the Arian Creed. I might have misunderstood him, but it sounded like he said it wasn't even around then. Folks, let me tell you something. All 58 verses of 1 Corinthians are in the earliest papyri. They might even be dated from 150, but by 200, anyway, all 58 verses are there. So it's nothing that took, like Arians would be 4th century. It's there. Mary Magdalene or Peter? Sure, Paul starts out with Peter. And so does Luke, by the way, as far as the men are concerned. Now, I admit, the women, appearances to the women predate the men. We can discuss this. But in the early church, sorry ladies, they generally did not let women testify in a court of law. They did, but not usually. Now, I think that's wrong, and we probably all think it's wrong. But that, according to most scholars, is why Paul did not start. It's not Paul anyway, it's a pre-Pauline creed. But that's why they did not start with the women. Because if you're going to put your best foot forward, put Peter out there. And the very first appearance to the men, we're told by both Paul and Luke, is to Peter. 500 witnesses at one time. Thank you. 500 witnesses at one time. This is like the Acts objection. He says, well, tell me where this thing fits in the Gospels. On the methodology I'm doing tonight, it's irrelevant. Now, I'll tell you where Gospel scholars put it. I'll just go ahead and put that in there, but this isn't the point I'm trying to make. Gospel scholars will often try to say the most likely place for the appearance of the 500 in the gospel narrative is the appearance in the mountain in Galilee. If 5,000 could be out there for the feeding of the 5,000 or the Sermon on the Mount, certainly 500 could be out there. I'm just telling you what the commentaries say. But once again, the reason I'm not trying to put Paul into the Gospels is because the way I set this argument out, I'm only using Paul. So to say, why can't we find this in the Gospels is a red herring to me. I want to talk about Paul. 7 epistles. He said, well, look, there's some epistles that almost everybody, at least critical scholars, think Paul didn't write. And he's correct. There's 13 epistles. Hebrews is not one of them, but there's 13 epistles that bear Paul's name. I already said G.A. Wells. The list that most scholars will give you is about 7. G.A. Wells throws Colossians in there. But watch, if there's epistles that we don't use, guess what? We just won't use them. It's not an issue. Let's talk about the 7 or 8 authentic epistles. Because if he says, I won't agree with you on the pastorals, the example he used, I'd say, let's set the pastorals aside for tonight. Let's talk about only 2. I only use 2 texts. 1 Corinthians 15 and the break between Galatians 1 to Galatians 2. It's the only one I'm using. I don't care about books that somebody thinks aren't written by Paul. Let's talk about the ones that the agnostic Bart Ehrman, New Testament specialist, says are the undisputed Pauline epistles. He basically, by undisputed, he means virtually no one disagrees. Let's talk about the positive material, not red herrings. The last thing I have here, data and the timeline. Folks, let me remind you, this timeline is not Gary Habermas's. I did not invent this. This came from the 60s and 70s from highly critical scholars. The Garrett Ludemans, Don Crossan's, I mentioned them, the Bart Ehrmans of the world. This is not a believer's contrived timeline. It's a skeptically contrived timeline, if it's contrived. But what I'm saying is it didn't come from us. So critical scholars do it. I think it's fair if we use data that we share for good reasons.
So we now move into a time of open discussion between Gary and Ken, and which of you would like to begin?
Well, if I may make a response. Thank you, Gary, for that contribution. I mean, it does open a door to many things. You mentioned about, quoting scholars, which I know you are fond of. A ratio of 30-1 in terms of whether they agree more with you than with the position I'm stating. That's possibly true. I wouldn't doubt that those who doubt the official story are quite a minority. I mean, does that really surprise anybody? I mean, isn't it easier to believe than to think? He mentions Bart Ehrman as a skeptic. What he doesn't mention is he actually used to be a born-again Christian evangelical. Why has he changed? Why has he changed? Because he studied the manuscripts in great detail over a long period of time. He lost his faith because he studied the data. Now, we're talking here of evidence for a fantastic event. You all are familiar with that phrase, extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. Well, I'm not going to push the point that far, but I would say this, that we need pretty good evidence, not flaky evidence, not marginal evidence, not evidence that we can interpret with a favourable Christian gloss. Now let me make a comparison, if I may, graphically, between the evidence of the resurrection, which appears in the New Testament. There it is, including the slight references in Revelations to the one who comes with a sword from his mouth. But the other standard references of the resurrection, they fit quite comfortably on an A4 sheet, rather fewer than 600 words. To give you a comparison of that, something else that has something in the order of 600 words, a McDonald's Happy Meal menu. Now, would anybody here be convinced, let's say, of the nutritional value of a McDonald's Happy Meal on the basis of 600 words? Can we be convinced, therefore, that a few pages of the Gospel speak of some extraordinary event?
He said I can interrupt you, Ken.
Yep, sure be.
Wow. This is great. Okay, Bart Ehrman used to be an evangelical. This is our discussion time, and he's a neat guy. He really is. Bart Ehrman used to be an evangelical. Ken, we're not going to solve this by going back and forth. By the way, Bart Ehrman has said in his most recent book it wasn't the manuscripts, it was the problem of evil that bothered him the most. So it wasn't...
Problem of?
Evil. It wasn't a... And then later, I'm sure he's bothered by the text, but he just said in his latest book, his latest revelation is, it's the problem of evil. But you know what? If you want to start going down the line, I mean, we could say, hey, this guy's converted by studying the evidence, this guy's converted by... And the list is long. As far as extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, I keep saying over and over again, I'm only using text and data as allowed by almost the furthest folks down on that side. I didn't invent this. Here's my point. If they think it's good enough to talk about it, perhaps you'll allow me to use their data and talk about it. I don't think that's weak. I think there's a lot of other data here we could put on the table. I'd be glad to do that. For example, I mean, this would just be, it'd be a wild herring. But if somebody's saying something like, well, how am I supposed to believe in resurrection today? I mean, this is an extraordinary event. I think he started something like this. It started with this kind of idea. We're in the fairy tale world. I'll just put something out here, and we can pursue it during the Q&A if you want to. Recent studies of near-death experiences. Highly evidenced ones. I've been studying this phenomenon for 30 years. This is the only point I'm going to make by bringing this up. If we have evidence for an afterlife, if we do, and I think we do, then all of a sudden the resurrection doesn't look like the most extraordinary thing in the world that takes extraordinary evidence. It looks like a specific case of a phenomena for which we have other data. So I'll just throw that out there. If someone wants extraordinary evidence, let's talk about empirical data from the present. We can do that. But, I'd love to go back and forth here on some scholars. I'd love to talk about, Bob Price. And you do know, right, that Bob's like the only guy in the universe who holds that view. I mean, there's a couple other people, but almost nobody.
I don't think so. But surely the nature of a debate is to go backwards and forwards.
Go ahead. How many others do you know besides Bob?
I don't want to discuss scholars. That's just called,
That's just what?
I don't want to go through just quoting names. I'd rather deal with some facts here.
But I mean, if you want
the
to
interesting thing, Gary, in your exposition is how interestingly you backtrack from your overall view to minimalistic claims then, okay? If we can prove that quite a few of the Pauline epistles are fraudulent, then you're quite happy to dish them. Make do with the ones you've got left. Well, is this a scientific method? I mean, what sort of method it is? This is the sort of thing that I began by saying. Christian apologetics is simply the determination to defend ancient truths at all costs. And so you will bring forward...
But atheism is not that.
You will bring forward any and every
Humanism is nothing
use
like
you
that,
can
is it?
to defend an indefensible position. That should...
But Ken, that's precisely why I've chosen this methodology, not to cite my facts. Dom Crossan, Garrett Ludeman, the Jesus Seminar are not very well known for being evangelical apologists. In fact, they really hate it. And I'm using their data, and I'm saying, what's the best argument for this? Dom Crossan has just said recently, Tom Wright, for those of you who know Bishop Tom Wright, we're going to be together in London in just 2 days. Great guy, 800-page book on the resurrection. He argues the evidence. Guess what? He's debated Dom Crossan 3 times. I was there all 3 times. And I heard Dom say this in all 3 debates. Do you know what? I've been thinking about this material for a whole long time, and I think Tom's right on this. What? Now, I want to make it clear. Dom does not believe in the resurrection. But he thinks Tom's argument is right on. So I'm saying, this doesn't sound like a fallacious Christian apologist. Believers are out of control. We're using Dom Crossan's type data and going after it. They're your friends.
Gary, surely the point here is if we are rational, we will be led by the evidence.
That's
right.
We
will not put the horse behind the cart and say, this is the truth that we want to establish. We know the truth. It comes to us by faith. Therefore, what facts can we purport to prove this truth? Now, that is not a scientific method. That is simply apologetics.
I don't argue that way. In fact, what you may not know about me is I spent 10 years as a skeptic. And you ready? I used to debate Christians. And I used to tell them they were crazy. And I either became a Buddhist or I was very close to be. I don't know why, but I was somewhere else down the religious trail. I came back to this not because I'm exercising faith and I'm just, golly gee, looking for facts to back up my faith. I said, what do I do with this data? And frankly, this is just my personal testimony. It doesn't mean a lot, but I mean, it was the resurrection that jerked me back from this kind of stuff. Not, okay, here comes my faith, please let me find some data. It was the other way around.
Well, that is what you say, but I am losing track of the number of Christian apologists who claim to have been hard-headed atheists. You know, it's now par for the course. Well, I have to say, I have never been a Christian. I have always been a hard-headed atheist, and I have never seen anything that would come close to making me think, hey, the resurrection looks like a real event.
You know what? You need to come over to my house in the States. We'll talk over soccer, and we'll be working on that.
I'll happily do that. But I think if we are attempting to prove a historical truth, we can't begin with a conclusion and say, how can we come out with that result?
What's the conclusion?
Well, your conclusion is the resurrection is an historical fact, whatever.
No, I'm saying if you go back to
Do
35...
you entertain the possibility then it may not be true?
Absolutely.
You do?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, there is
sir.
Hope then. There is hope.
Yes, sir. I absolutely maintain it. And I will absolutely give it up. Hear me? I will absolutely give it up if the data are not there.
Well, tell me which of your defences of the resurrection then really convinces you. Never mind all this special pleading.
Which of these?
Which of all of them really convinces you? Let's take one practice. Let me give you, for example. In many of your books, in fact all of them probably, you make this claim that the disciples suffered until death for their beliefs.
No, I don't say they suffered unto death. I said they were willing to suffer. You know why the reason why I do that, Ken?
Well, it's safer. It's safer because the evidence doesn't support it. That's
exactly. Why. Not the safer one, the evidence one. I don't say that. And just today at Oxford University, I said to the students, don't say that all the disciples died for their faith. We don't have early data for that. And I went through it. The reason I don't say it is not because it's safer. I say it because we don't have data. But the 4 people who are there in Jerusalem, we do have first century data for 3 of the 4. Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus. Only John, we do not have first centuries. But I don't go around saying we can prove the other disciples. There's about 7 of them, Eusebius, I think. I don't cite Eusebius. He's too late. He fails my own rules.
Yes, okay. Do you want to quote the Epistle of Clement?
I'd love to. What do you want to know about it?
Well, okay, because that is one of your standard defences, that even Peter and Paul died.
That's correct.
Yeah?
And what's wrong with Clement?
Yeah. Well, shall we actually quote the words? Does he actually say
which version?
They were martyred?
He both said yes.
No, he does not.
Wait a minute.
He does not.
Well, it depends on which. Here we go. It depends on which There's 2 translations of Clement. One is very, very clear. They suffered martyrdom. The weaker of the 2, it says, the weaker of the 2, the strong one specifically says they testified to Jesus Christ and went to their graves as martyrs believing. The stronger one. Even the weakest translation says something like this. It says, Paul and Peter went to their reward believing. They died. He says they died. That's the weaker.
Okay. I mean, I think that's closer to the words I
close.
have.
Okay.
Which says nothing. It says nothing. They did their work for Christ, as it would be, and then they died. Maybe they were with their Lord in heaven.
For their faith.
No evidence that they were ever martyrs.
No. Okay, here's where we can argue about it all night. But the scholar's interpretation of 1 Corinthians 5, Clement 5, not the 1 Corinthians of Paul, but Clement 5, is that Clement is talking about martyrdom. I'll even say, I'll bet you'll find that if you go back to the research. But of the stronger statement, it's clearly true. And now James, the brother of Jesus.
And can we declare what the original meaning of the word martyr was?
What do you mean, can we declare
The word martyr actually means witness. Fine. It doesn't mean anyone who suffered and died.
Do you know who it started with?
Well, I'm sure you will tell us.
Justin Martyr, 2nd century.
Okay, much later than your apostles.
Sure, but my point is just to establish the word martyr. Well, it's 50 years later. It's not hugely later. He goes to his death for his testimony as a Christian philosopher, and he dies. He dies for that. By the way, the other one is James, and it's reported by Josephus. the stoning of James, the fourth
Well, we can
one.
come back to that one, but I'd like to stick with this point about what Christians understand by the idea of persecution and what Christians understand by the idea of martyrdom. Because it's quite clear that early Christians certainly thought any form of treatment that didn't accord with their wishes was some form of persecution. That if their family were critical of their Christian faith, they were being persecuted. And their martyrdom was actually to witness to the faith that they had. It had nothing to do with suffering unto death or a willingness to suffer unto death. And we really don't have, as you say, most of the so-called 12 apostles. We could argue about the four that we do have.
Okay, Paul gives a list of things he suffered. Remember, shipwrecked 3 times, beaten 40 minus 1. Actually, beaten 40 minus 1 3 times. He's stoned and left for dead outside. Paul lists these things he went through, and then tradition tells us he was finally beheaded during the reign of Nero in the early 60s.
No evidence.
Okay, but all I'm saying is, I think that's a fair definition of persecution. Being stoned and left for dead, whipped 3 times, 40 minus 1 lashes. I think those are fair definitions. I think he's justified in saying it was persecuted.
How would that be so if we're dealing with a religious tract that has no basis in fact? How do we know that
What's the religious tract?
How do we know that what Paul wrote was actually truthful? Who else validates the claims of Paul? Unlike Jesus Christ, which you can claim is referred to here and there, nobody else refers to Paul. He doesn't appear in any secular history at all.
He does appear in one secular source, and he does appear in 5 Christian sources that can be considered early. Now, if Christians are prejudiced because they mention Paul, then atheists are prejudiced for confirming atheism. I mean, it's not like atheists are automatically valueless and Christians have all kinds of values. Both sides have access to grind. Both sides have access to grind.
I don't think anyone makes themselves rich by being an atheist. But plenty of people make themselves rich by being Christians.
But what does that have to do with who has
they
an
have a vested interest in maintaining untruths in a way that an unbeliever does not.
But you don't have an axe to grind. You just come at this totally neutrally, and you don't have any beliefs. You bring nothing to the data. Ken, I'm not being nasty, but a cure for that is a course in philosophy.
I, like anybody else, including yourself, Gary, have subjective views on things.
You sure do, and so do I.
But what is the more extraordinary claim, then? That God exists and raises people from the dead, or, in the absence of any evidence to that effect, that it's not true?
Well, Ken, it's certainly not in the absence of evidence, but you say, which is more extraordinary? See, your comment betrays the same kind of angle, the prejudice that we all have. It betrays the same thing. When you say, what in the world could make you believe in God or resurrection or afterlife or something like that, that's a complicated thesis that we're unwarranted in conceding only from a naturalistic viewpoint. If God exists, and if there's an afterlife and if there's a resurrection, it's all of a sudden it's just not uncomplicated, it's the answer for the universe. What I mean is for you to say, that's an extraordinary thesis and incredible to believe. Because if you're an atheist, of course it is. That shows that kind of angle that I'm saying philosophy will kind of knock out of you if you take a philosophy class. It tells us we all have an axe to grind, and your view from my angle is incredible, and my view from your angle is incredible. That both shows we have an angle.
I don't believe the rejection of the extraordinary and the fantastic and the fabulous in the absence of clear proof is an axe to grind. That should be the position that we all adopt. We should not believe the extraordinary unless it can be disproved. I mean, that would be lunacy. Why don't we believe in Jack and the Beanstalk or
Snow White
or any such story?
We're back at the beginning of your paper or your speech, which was, took some notes here, it's sad that religion is still with us today. Ken, the reason we're still talking about religion in the city of David Hume is because, listen, if there were no data, and a bunch of fanatics from both sides, because we're all, everyone's got an axe to grind, running around giving both sides, it wouldn't have survived. The reason we're still talking about it, and there's a Tom Wright who's taught at both Oxford and Cambridge, that there's a Jimmy Dunn at Durham, that there's a Larry Hurtado right here at Edinburgh. The reason these folks are around, that Richard Burridge at London, Richard Bauckham just retires from, the reason that goes on in academia, guess what? I think they would be drummed out of court if there weren't some data to talk about. It wouldn't be around. Because listen, if these guys are doing this kind of stuff, folks, let me tell you about my belief. I believe in Christianity. Now let's all try this semester to find some facts to back up our faith. I don't think they'd be full professors. I don't think they'd be around it. I feel too strongly about the British universities to say those guys hold important chairs for reasons. Now, quoting the names isn't going to help us, but the names show data. The names show reasons to believe. And I think the reason they hold these chairs, Larry Hurtado, I understand, is the head of the department here at Edinburgh. The reason they're still alive is because there's still data to talk about, like this right here.
What you are not acknowledging in that statement, Gary, is that the church is an institution of society that dominated Europe for 1,500 years. We have only escaped its clutches in the last 200. Of course there is a religious establishment, and it has its centers of power and authority. It has all the gloss of being part of the establishment. Of course it regards any rational critique as equally as fanatical as itself.
So the church runs Oxford and Cambridge.
No, it doesn't.
And Edinburgh
But the origins of those universities are very much.
But I mean, if the Pope or Rowan Williams is going to say something like, this is what we believe in this country. I think you ought to have chairs at Durham and Edinburgh, and that's not going to put, Oxford doesn't listen to the church.
Yeah, but you're putting history backwards. Where were those centers of authority before the modern era? They were in the hands of the church.
That's fine. But this is 2008, and this is a secular university system in your country and in my country. These are secular university systems.
Well, you have
West.
more than a secular university system.
That's fine. Okay, yeah. Fine. Ken, in a secular university system, I'll ask the same question you asked when you started your paper. Why are we still talking about this in a secular university system with major chairs at Oxford, Cambridge, and Edinburgh? Why? It's not because there's nothing to talk about, or we wouldn't be talking about them.
As you wish.
There's more to be said there, but we'll turn now to some Q&A. And if you'd like to raise your hands, the stewards with the roving mics will come to you. Okay, seeing quite a few questions around. Gentleman in the middle there. Yep, that's you. Okay, try and get the... No, sorry, behind you there. Yes, yourself, that's it. Okay.
I didn't hear your last question.
Sorry, before you join Lincoln University, you have to sign to a code which says you believe in the Bible and these Bible truths. Is that not the case?
I do?
Well, anyone who wants to study at Liberty University.
No, that's not true. No. Well, you can be an atheist and be accepted at Liberty University. Really? Yes, sir. Ken can go to Liberty. In fact, I hope he does. No, I understand. Repeat the question. Sure. Sure. Good question. And I appreciate his attitude. In case you didn't hear, he said, I'm not, picking on you and so on. I've been asked to repeat the question. I'm probably not going to do a great job with repeating it, but it goes something like this. You talk about the secular university system, that's because I'm in this country and I was talking about guys who teach at those major schools I mentioned. But he said, what about your university? It's a religious school. Don't students have to be Christians to sign a statement of faith to go there, and no drinking and no this and no this and no this? No, you could be an atheist and come to Liberty University. Now, is it a Christian university? Yes, it is. But listen, I make no qualms about being an evangelical Christian. I do not hide that. It's everything I write. Nobody who knows me thinks I'm trying to hide that or trying to pretend like Liberty's like Oxford. Nothing like that. I'm just saying that here's my whole point. The guys I'm quoting are from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge. Would I still be there? No, you're right, I wouldn't be. I wouldn't go there and hold that. But that's not my point. Here's my whole question. Using the fellows that I started tonight from these major British universities and many, many other schools, here's my question. Can I, as a Christian, okay, if you say, well, listen, tell me the truth. What do you think about the Bible? You're asking, and if you ask me this, I'll say, hey, listen, I think the Bible is the Word of God. I think it's a trustworthy book. I would tell you that, but that's not the way I started. Tonight, I want to ask, are there enough pieces of data from well-known scholars that I don't have to do this from my viewpoint? I will not come here and say, I believe the Bible's inspired. Let's start with that and see if there's a resurrection. Wow, there's a resurrection. Okay, I'm going to believe. No, I'm saying, can we start with people like, I won't repeat them again, but these major universities around us here, can we start with their presuppositions and get there? And I'm saying yes. It's really irrelevant where I teach or what I believe. I'll just concede for you I'm an evangelical Christian. I'm okay with that. But here's what I'm asking. Could you still get there on non-evangelical presuppositions? That's my question.
Josh, can I make a contribution here? Because we've heard the question, I hope, and we've heard Gary's response. Let me quote from Liberty University's own website, and it reads as follows. Faculty join Liberty only after completing a rigorous interview process that confirms a born-again relationship with Christ, a clear understanding of the purpose and aims of Liberty. Now, to me, that doesn't sound as if that would take on board an atheist.
No. I'm talking about a student.
A student.
He said, I thought he said, could you go there? And you definitely can be an atheist.
Let's move on to the next question.
Okay.
Yes, you said that the story that you told would supply sufficient evidence for a non-evangelical to consider that story is correct. Well, on the basis that statement is made, then is it not the case that Joseph Smith, who we certainly know existed, and had eyewitness testimony of the angel Moroni, his testimony, which is much more recent and followed by millions of Americans as well, or whatever else, who are often very intelligent people, why should we believe a possibly conjectural figure from 2,000 years ago and not believe Joseph Smith or the Prophet Muhammad, or actually, for that matter, one of perhaps 20 million Americans who have been abducted by aliens? I mean, particularly given the fact that the Gospels do not agree with each other in almost any major respect as far as when or even where or by whom or by how many people this individual was seen. I mean, Matthew 27:53 tells us that the graves opened after an earthquake as Jesus died, and 3 days later, dozens or a large quantity of the Jewish saints were resurrected as well, walked up into the city of Jerusalem, and were seen by many people. Now, if we throw that out, as evidence. It's funny how we never hear Christians talking about that. You would have thought that that would be a spectacular piece of evidence for the divinity of Christ. But that is very, very much under the carpet. If we throw that out, what on earth warrant could we have to suppose that, let's say he did exist, right? This guy...
Thank you. I think we've got the gist of the question.
Well, fine.
Okay. So,
I didn't hear it.
How did he even recognize it was Jesus? He'd never
Why
met
don't
him
you just
before.
repeat it, that I won't have to repeat
the first part of the question was about the existence of the Mormon Church. Why should this audience believe you, Gary, over Joseph Smith and his account of faith? And the second part of the question was about Matthew 27:53, and to do with the breaking of the tombs. I understand it in Matthew 27. Why don't Christians use that evidence more?
Why don't we use it more? Okay. Two questions. Mormonism, Matthew 27. Folks, it's not my job tonight. I'm not trying to go after any other belief system. I'm not trying to say, you're a loser for this or that. That's not my job. But if I were to investigate the Mormon claim and say, isn't this the same sort of claim? You have eyewitnesses, they were early. I guess that's where you're going. They're early eyewitnesses and so on. One major problem with this is that there are witnesses who were supposed to have seen the plates and so on, and virtually every single one of them whose name is not Smith left or got kicked out of the church. Now, if you tried to import that into the New Testament, you'd say, well, we have these 12 guys, but Peter got kicked out for this, so-and-so walked out. What I'm saying is, it's a different situation. I'm just saying it's not analogous, okay? It's not analogous on the grounds of data. As far as Matthew 27, I have a really easy response, and it goes like this. I'm not trying to defend everything in the Bible tonight. I want to talk about this, and if you said to me, I'm not saying you're saying this, but if you said, I don't like Matthew 27, and I said, man, it's part of it. And you go, well, I don't like it. And you go, fine, but I'm discussing this. Let's just make it this way. I could say to you, you're right. Have it your way on Matthew 27. Okay. It's not the resurrection of Jesus. So I could say, hey, I'm here to discuss the resurrection. What do you do about this? See, again, let me repeat this. My methodology is to accept what critical scholars accept and to talk about that. They don't like Matthew 7:53 and following. You're right. So I don't bring it up because it's not one of the datum they want to speak about. So I'm not free to speak about it because I will only... In other words, my methodology avoids the whole thing unless critical scholars concede it. They don't concede that. You're correct. So I won't use it. I don't talk about it because I'm in their genre. I'm in their timeline. This is developed by them, not by conservatives.
Well, yeah, I'll only make a small point because I think the point is well made. If the basis of Gary's claims for the resurrection of a truer Christianity, or that particular the mainstream Christianity, it should surely be true of the Mormon Church. I mean, in a sense, we have no doubt that the Smith family existed. There's no ambiguity there. So, why believe one or the other? But of course, really, in our heart of hearts, we know they're both fraudulent. Of course, the opening of the tombs and Gary's methodology has to be admired. It's pick a mix, whatever will fit. If that one won't work, let's get the next one. It's an admirable approach. It's sort of like any contingency will do. Doesn't convince me.
Let's go on to the next question, please. Okay, let's have this lady at the front here, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, of course, we're talking about everything because it's so obscure. The Bible is so obscure. But we're really going on about source criticism tonight. And I wanted to ask you really about what's Paul's angle, and put it to you like this. Say you have a Jewish group who have created a religion, their own God, and it's one God, and it's only one God. Don't you need then to do something about the rest of the world? How are you going to bring them into the story? And wouldn't you need to create an alternate angle for them to pursue, like the Noahide? Wouldn't you need to create something? Wouldn't Paul actually have needed to create a new religion? The sidekick for Judaism would be Christianity. Wouldn't Saul have been dubious? Wouldn't he have a vested interest in creating something to bring us all into the belief in this one God, a Jewish God? Isn't there some angle there that he has that we need to think of if we're really looking at source criticism?
Okay, I'm using, this whole thesis assumes source criticism, so I'm using source criticism, and that source criticism is a generic title under which there are several kinds of criticism, and that's the sort I'm using here. As far as why wouldn't Paul want to do something like this, from every source we know, whether it's Acts or Paul's own epistles, these genuine epistles, Philippians chapter 1, Galatians chapter 1, Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, I persecuted the church when he was Saul. Let's put it this way, there's not a speck of evidence that implies or says or indicates, not a speck of first century data that says that Paul was tired, wanted to give up, wanted to switch sides, wanted to universalize Judaism. I think that would be a very foreign set of ideas to New Testament scholarship, I mean critical New Testament scholarship. I don't see Paul wanting to do anything. He wanted to wipe the sect out. He said, I thought I was doing God a favor by taking men, women, and children and imprisoning or killing them. If we accept Acts as historical, he sits at the feet of the man Stephen while he's stoned. I don't see any evidence to believe that Paul wants to start a religion. Now, see, here's one of the things I would say. Why do we need to give a bunch of evidences for this, but we can have a theory like maybe Paul went off the deep end, or maybe Paul wanted to spread a universal religion, but no evidence for it. There's no evidence that Paul wanted to move in a different direction. But sometimes we feel that if we give the opposite side, we can speak without evidence. Sometimes we can just postulate. My other reason for that, number one, no evidence. Paul says he did the opposite. Second, on this timeline, that was one of the main things I was referring to. This wasn't Paul's idea. Paul got it from somebody else. Paul gets it from Peter, James, John. Now Paul also saw Jesus, if you believe the New Testament accounts. But what I'm saying is, the whole point of this was, it wasn't Paul's idea. And then when I mentioned Hurtado and Jimmy Dunn and Richard Bauckham taking it back to 30 AD, Paul wasn't a believer. I mean, that's when he was fighting against the church. So in other words, the people who were around, who were teaching the deity of Christ and the resurrection before Paul, that would show you it's not Paul's idea. If it predates Paul, it's not Paul. So I would say two large arguments are, number one, you have to answer this data and why people have it before Paul. And my first point was, we don't have one bit of data that says that Paul was this or that and decided to start a new religion. I don't think we're justified in starting something new, starting a thesis without data. To just contribute there, certainly some scholars do maintain that Paul is the true author of Christianity. My own comment would be that we shouldn't look for a simplistic explanation for the phenomenon of Christianity. The Christian world today is a house divided. We all know that, in many, many sects. It was no different in the early days. Christianity has always been divided, and certainly in that crucial period of the first couple of centuries, there were a multitude of different creeds, different Christianities, and the Pauline trend was just one of them, and that's a fact that we should realise, that the Gospels as we know them are the result of a struggle between those groups over a couple of hundred years.
Let's turn to the next question, please. And yes, this gentleman down at the front, please. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question for Mr. Humphreys primarily, and it's just a question of motive, really. I was wondering what it is about the person of Jesus that you think persuaded so many thousands of Jews who had clung to their beliefs religiously, if you excuse the pun, for several centuries in the face of considerable persecution from most of the empires going. What was it about the person of Jesus that provoked them to throw in, or at least substantially modify, many of these beliefs? Or to put it another way, what was it particularly about the early believers that made them so incredibly persuasive that they could, well, really alter a religion that had showed remarkable resilience in not being possible to alter it for so many centuries?
Yeah. A good question. And it's one of the pillars of the historical Jesus school, that there was this mass conversion and the church grew in some explosive fashion. The problem is, outside of Christian references, that is a position that one cannot maintain. The interesting thing about early Christianity is its invisibility. It wasn't so apparent. Now, we have the alternative, we have the option of believing the Big Bang origin, in other words, the birth of a Messiah from a virgin and the crucifixion and the resurrection and so on. That would be one explanation if you want to. But another explanation, which I think is more convincing, is that Christianity emerged from Judaism as a result of the suffering of the Jewish people. They had waged and lost 2 major wars with Rome, and that was a crisis for their religion. And that, I think, was the impetus for the emergence of the various Christian sects. And it fits the evidence more closely, because you cannot, no matter how many claims are made, I know there are references in the book of Acts for, 3,000 converts, it claims, after the episode of speaking in tongues. But do we really believe that happened? There is no historical residue of any mass conversion of the Jews until a century or so later. So, I don't accept that something miraculous came along and converted Jews from a faith. It was the suffering in the wars against Rome that led to their religion breaking into more than one element.
Real quickly, 2 recent Jewish scholars, non-Christian, no Christian axe to grind. Pinchas Lapid, 1982, The Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective, and very, very recently, just appeared off the press, Geza Vermesh, Jewish history professor emeritus, Oxford University. 2 Jews, not Christian, both examined the data. Conclusion, Jesus was raised from the dead. No axe to grind. I think that's interesting. He says nobody outside of the book of Acts recorded the explosion of early Christianity. Let me give you some names. Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius. 3 Roman historians. If you count Josephus as a Roman historian, count him as a Jewish historian, whatever you want. All 3 of them. Tacitus says, after this pernicious doctrine was destroyed, he said, when Pilate killed Jesus, he says the thing broke out again and spread around. It came all the way around the empire to Rome. So does Suetonius. Josephus talks about this. I'm just saying we have this recorded from other people. And one comment about the 4 Gospels came out of a struggle of centuries. Folks, listen. As the first century closed, there were only 4 Gospels in existence. It's not my fault if the early church took the only 4 books there were at that time. They just happened to be the Gospels. It wasn't like there were 10 others and they ignored them. They were the only 4 that were around in 100 AD.
Gary, can I make a quick response to that? As you well know, you mentioned the name Josephus there as a Jewish historian, and of course he's a very important source. And everybody knows that the single paragraph in the Antiquities of the Jews is at the minimum been tampered with, and in all probability is fake. And whatever else you might quote as a source, we are indebted to the Christian scribes for copies of them.
You said probability is what? That it's what? The quote in Josephus?
That the paragraph that refers to the tribe of Christians is fake.
The whole paragraph?
Well, you see, that's the point. Yes, scholars do, I know, argue, well, a bit of this testimony has been fake, but not all of it. But I mean, that's a pretty weak argument.
Now listen, one guy in the world could hold something and be right. I'll admit that. But the almost total position in the world is there are phrases in there which are questionable, but the statement itself, the base statement, is correct. That testimony comes from James Charlesworth, Princeton University, not Liberty University's religion department. This comes from Princeton University. He's tallying up, this is his area, he tallies it up. Majority of scholars. John Drain, another British scholar, Stirling University, says the same thing. So, sure, we can debate that. By the way, the three names I mentioned, Josephus has the least to say about this. Tacitus and Suetonius say more. Suetonius said it spread all the way around the Mediterranean and we failed to stamp it out when it came to Rome. That's a huge explosion of belief.
Let's move on to our next question, please. And there's a gentleman, I think, at the back in the green. Yep.
Firstly, I want to thank you both for your very vivid and interesting discussions. Like you said, Gary, there are an incredible amount of presuppositions that you both bring, and one of yours seems to be that good historiography means a watertight argument. And Ken, yours seems to be something along the lines that there's this Kantianesque rational man that needs defending from some big bad wolf, or something. But what my question really is just to take it away slightly from where you've been, is so what? I mean, if I was to believe either of your arguments, what's that got to do with anything? And we can see with the plurality of questions, there's an awful lot of claims to be said even on one issue. What is it about your arguments that means anything anyway? I mean, what is this rational man, Ken, and what's he meant to look like? And Gary, so what if your historiography is correct? What's that got to do with anything?
I did not hear it. No.
Okay, so the question was, if we take Ken's rational man, and if we take Gary's account of the resurrection of Jesus on historical grounds, what has that got to say to us today? I think that's the gist of the question. Yeah? Okay.
What does it have to say today?
What does it mean
and
for...
Did you ask both of us to respond?
Yes, he did.
Go ahead, Ken.
Well...
What would you say that
if I understand the question correctly, which and I did have difficulty hearing it, I'd say rational man has given us the modern world. Rational man makes it possible to us to be here and speak these words tonight. Christianity had its best shot for 15 centuries. And what did it give us? What did it give us? Wars, suffering, inhumanity. You know, sorry? That's God. Has that stopped? Well, I doubt it. No, it hasn't. But, you know, the progress that humanity has made is thanks to rational man. Irrational man gave us nothing.
And here I was ready to say something nice about preaching and whatnot. I have to say something. Take all the Christian atrocities you want to and dump them together. And I'm going to admit, Christians fail. Christians can be jerks. Christians can ignore Jesus and they should have followed him, they didn't. And if they were more ethical, they would have done this and that. I admit that. But I will say this, and that I just saw the statistic the other day, over 120 million deaths in the 20th century alone by atheistic regimes. Over 120. That doesn't solve anything. I'm just saying you can't say, because Christians do these dastardly things, hey, let's look over the fence. Let's say what's going on over here. Okay, but the question itself, great question. I would love to chat about, I mean, I'd like to spend the rest of my career talking about so what. I'd like to spend the rest of my career saying, what's the resurrection mean? I'm down here on this end of things because you can see tonight there's a lot of healthy questioning about it, and this is where I do my work. I think the resurrection speaks about a lot of things today. Let me just say one thing. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul, one of those authentic epistles, Paul says Christians grieve when they lose a loved one. He says they grieve, but not as those without hope. If the resurrection occurred, if. And that says something about an afterlife. If that or anything says something about an afterlife. I think grieving with hope is a tremendous difference in progress over grieving without hope. Now, Ken, I'm sure, is going to say, well, doesn't this all depend on whether the resurrection occurred or not? And if that's where he would go, that's what I would say if I were down there, and that's correct. But I think there's some good reasons for it, and so I would say, yeah, I think at the end of the day, it makes... Paul says, for example, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, we don't have any ethics. Christians don't... You cannot base an objective ethical system on atheism. You could have an ethical system, but you can't have an objective...
Do we want to live with illusions just because they make us feel good?
Well, right, but here's what we're debating tonight. Is it an illusion?
That's
and again,
that is
why
what,
do we
that is
still
what we're
debate
debating.
this in our universities?
Let's have one final question, please, and we will have. Let's have the gentleman at the back there. There we go. Yes. In the blue top. Yeah, that's you. Yep.
Thank you both very much. It's been very, very interesting. Professor, I really felt the need to pick up on something you said just there. I was going to ask a different question, but now you've given me what I think is a more interesting one to ask. I mean, you just said 120 million people were killed in atheist regimes in the 20th century. You've used the word atheist there, but I think what you mean is communist. Now, communism is only one atheist doctrine. It's not even the most popular one. In fact, my understanding is that there was significant collaboration by religious believers with communist regimes, and communism to me is no more rational, and I think what Kenneth has been defending tonight is rationalism above all. Communism to me is no more rational than any form of theism. I just wondered if you had any comment on that.
I'm sorry.
The question was, communism is no more rational than any form of theism, and that essentially that communism wasn't necessarily an atheistic belief. It was actually supported by Christians, according to the questioner.
It was what?
Supported by Christians, or those holding some sort of Christian conviction.
Okay, and what are you asking me?
This is an argument that is used very regularly as soon as the atrocities of religions are raised by the secular and what I would call the rational side. Religious believers naturally fire backwards, but communism ... And I say